Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today's lecture, we're kind of change gears again a little bit. We're going to leave politics a little bit behind. It's still going to be there in the background, but we're going to kind of look at some regional differences that are starting to kind of emerge in our country here in the 19th century before the Civil War. And we're going to kind of do that by first exploring the Old South. That's what some people kind of refer to this particular period as, right? It's also known as the Antebellum South, the South that existed before the Civil War. So today we're going to kind of actually start laying the foundations for what causes why the Civil War is going to be possible to even happen, right? Because think about it, in order to have a civil war, you have to have a deeply divided country, a country where people kind of see themselves as fundamentally different, as just kind of foreigners in their own land, so to speak, right? So to kind of explain how we can get to the Civil War, we have to explain how this North and South are becoming so different that they can see each other as different people, as foreign peoples, as dangerous outsiders, right? So to do that, we're going to kind of start exploring these two regions. This week, we're going to look at the Antebellum South, the Old South, and what made it different than the North. And then next week, we'll look at the North and kind of explain how it's changing and how it's kind of moving away from kind of that shared, combined kind of identity that Northerners and Southerners had during the colonial period and even right after independence. But here in the 19th century, that's beginning to shift. And of course, if we're going to talk about the Old South, I just kind of want you to stop and think for a minute, what that means to you. If I say Old South or the Antebellum South, are there any images that pop into your mind, right? Are there any mental images that you kind of see that kind of define or help you understand what that term means, right? Because that's the world we want to look at here, is what makes the South, what makes it different than the North. It's the only way you can have a civil war. So start thinking about what you think of when somebody says the South before the Civil War, what it means. And I would kind of say there's a few things that pop in your mind. First of all, probably the idea of slavery, right? That slavery is a big part of that. And of course, that is most of what we're talking about today. But there's something else there as well, right? There's usually another image that kind of pops into people's minds. And it's really kind of maybe the defining image in some ways of the Old South, of what it meant to be a Southerner, of what a lot of Southerners aspired to here during this period before the Civil War. And it's not as remote and as foreign and as distant in the past as maybe some people think. I would kind of say even those of us here at Fresno State have maybe been a little closer to the Old South than we actually have ever thought about in some ways, right? And of course, to kind of bring that home, to kind of show you what I'm talking about, let me show you this image here of a place that kind of defines maybe what the South looked like at one time. Here is kind of a Southern plantation mansion, right? These big mansions in the middle of these huge agricultural lands, right? These estates owned by individuals. And these mansions kind of sat in the middle of them as kind of a testament to the wealth and power of the people that own them. This particular version, kind of rendition of a Southern plantation may look a little familiar to some of you. You may have actually been to it. Of course, this is the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland. And stop and think about that for a minute, right? There is a Southern plantation sitting in Disneyland. And it's in the midst of an area called, right, New Orleans Square. It is defined on kind of these Old South kind of ideals. So what we kind of notice here is there's a kind of a sanitized version of the Old South that a lot of Americans, even to this day, kind of hearken to. These big, beautiful mansions, women wearing these big, flowing, fancy gowns, parties and cotillions, right? People doing horse racing, right? These big, massive plantations where they grow cotton. But just like at Disneyland, we often kind of leave something out of it. Because at Disneyland, there are no slave quarters. There's no explanation of how all of this wealth is being built. What's allowing people these big fancy homes and all this jewelry and fine furnishings and all of that, right? That part of things is being kind of ignored, if you will, right? So what we're going to do today is kind of take a look at this old South that existed in its reality, right? Not kind of this cleaned up version, this politically correct version, if you will, where we leave out the things that are kind of disturbing or kind of difficult for us to kind of deal with. And to be honest with you, this will be a difficult lecture at times. Some of the things, some of the stories I'm going to tell you, some of the issues we're going to confront really do kind of bring home just how awful this system is that's allowing all of this wealth, and then frankly just how deeply ingrained it becomes into Southern culture. Okay, so be ready for some of that. You may not agree with everything I have to say, but you definitely should take a listen and kind of think about what I'm trying to point out to you, okay? So let's kind of start our tour here with a view of an actual Southern plantation. This is a plantation house up north of New Orleans along the Mississippi River. And you can kind of see something here, right? I mean, look at what this picture's doing here, right? Imagine yourself traveling in the 1840s, 1850s to this plantation, this immense cotton plantation, where there's hundreds of slaves working in the field or working in the houses, right? Taking care of all of this. Look at what the owner of this plantation wants you to see as they come up. I mean, think about it. Trees don't normally grow the way they're being done here, right? They've been cleared to do this, right? They've been pruned to kind of give this effect. The person that owns this property, as you come to visit them, wants you to see their house, wants you to focus on this big, huge mansion that they've had. And they're making a statement here. As you've gone maybe hours across their land by horse or by foot, walking across their thousands of acres, they want you to see just how much wealth they've been able to amass, just how important they are in their society, really almost in the country. Some of the wealthiest Americans here before the Civil War are these plantation owners. And I'll kind of give you some examples of that as we go along. So wealth and status are incredibly important to these people that are kind of at the top of the pyramid here in the Old South, the Antebellum South. They want you to know how rich, how powerful they are, how they can afford such nice, fine things. It is incredibly important for them to kind of put those things out there, right? To make visitors understand just how rich and how powerful they are, how influential they are. And of course, it's very incumbent on them to protect all of this, right? They want to make sure that they can keep this lifestyle, that their children are educated and can take over this business when they get too old to run it anymore, that they keep growing the family wealth, right? And that's going to be kind of an important formula that we're going to see over and over again in today's lecture. People get this rich, they get this much land, this much wealth, this much power by reinvesting in it, right? This person probably didn't start out with thousands of acres in this big giant house, right? They amassed it slowly over time. As they sold crops of cotton off, they would buy more land, buy more slaves, build on more to their house, buy nicer things for their house, all in ways to kind of prove in their kind of social circles that they've made it, that they're somebody that needs to be paid attention to. So here in the Old South, we kind of see what's happening here, right? We kind of getting a feel for who these people are, how this world works. And we very much are going to look at this group of people that live in these homes. They're called the planter class by some historians. They're the wealthy elites. They are very much the master class that runs the South in a lot of ways. And you can kind of see from this particular mansion, also from upstate or upriver of New Orleans in Louisiana, sometimes they're not too subtle about how they feel about things. Right, this particular mansion may remind you of another white mansion that has columned porches out front. Right now, this planter is not saying they're the president of the United States. We're not looking at a picture of the White House, but what we are looking at is somebody that really does dominate their corner of the world, like the president of the United States dominates the nation. Right? If you're one of these planters, you're the richest person around. Right? There may be a few other planters like you. But they're pretty rare, right? For the most part, most people have to come to you, right? You're the leader in this community. You're the one that makes a lot of decisions because you have the most wealth. Think about it, because you're pretty far away from towns. If somebody needs a loan, you're the person they're going to go to. There's no banks nearby. The small farmers in the area, the small white farmers that have maybe 50, a couple hundred acres, their land's usually not as good as yours, so they can't grow a lot of cotton. They grow food to help you feed your slaves. So they're kind of beholden on you for a customer, right? If you decide you don't like them anymore, you can cut them off, and then they're in real financial trouble. So these planters, they do absolutely dominate this world that they've created here, and they're going to be incredibly influential. And of course, one of the things they're going to want to do is protect and perpetuate this to make sure that this system that they've created for themselves continues on, and that they're going to remain at the top of Southern life for as long as they possibly can. So that's kind of the world that we're investigating here in the 1800s before the Civil War. And we're going to kind of notice some things happening here, right? There's a bit of a divergence, again, that's kind of starting to happen here, especially by the 1820s, 1830s. After Eli Whitney's invented the cotton gin and made cotton the new cash crop, the best cash crop Southerners have ever had. After the War of 1812 has kind of established the United States as a real nation. We have a functioning government under the Constitution. That is when these changes start to kind of develop. That's when we kind of see this shift starting to happen between the North and the South, in part because of this growth of the cotton industry, right? Northerners want as much cotton as Southerners can grow. Southerners are trying to grow as much as they possibly can, not just for Northern factories, but for also European factories. So in a very real way, if you can get into this game of growing cotton, getting land, getting slave labor to build things up, your life is going pretty good. And you're starting to think of it as a pretty good life that you like, that you're entitled to. And again, it kind of shows some differences. As the slave culture, right, as the slave labor system starts to permeate the South more and more. Remember one of those charts that I showed you from a couple lectures ago. As the amount of cotton is being increased, the production goes up. The number of slaves to produce all that cotton is also skyrocketing here. So these slave owners, right, this planter class that grows the most cotton, they very much are a part of this market economy that's developed here in the United States. Again, northern factories at first, very dependent on southern cotton, because southern cotton producers are some of the cheapest cotton producers in the world at the time. So they're helping kind of fuel this economic growth that's happening. But at the same time, there's something kind of different happening here. These southern slave owners, they have time to kind of pursue other interests, if you will, right? They don't have to stay on their farms all the time. These big plantations are actually so huge they couldn't run them by themselves. So they hire a lot of the poor white farmers in the area to work on their plantations. Not necessarily as farm labor, they're going to use slave labor for that, but as overseers, as people to kind of monitor things, to be business managers, so to speak, right? So again, they have an incredible amount of influence and control over their society. And of course, they want to make sure the society works well. They see themselves as kind of leaders, as father figures, what's kind of known as paternalism, right? Because they're men in charge, people should pay attention to them and listen to them. So in some ways, this is kind of a carryover of kind of these old colonial ideas of kind of social class and status, that if you were somebody that had a lot of wealth and had a lot of power that went with that wealth, people needed to pay a lot of attention to you, pay you respect as well, that idea of deference. Well, it's still kind of hanging on in a different form here in the 1800s in the Old South. But what is really different is kind of how Southerners think of this idea that they don't have to work on their farms. They don't have to be tied to the day-to-day operations of their plantations. Now, don't get me wrong, they're actually there doing a lot of work out in the fields quite often, sometimes disciplining their slaves personally themselves, right? So they are involved in these operations, but they don't have to be. They can step away from those things and do other things. And to these Southerners, these plantation owners, that very much is an ideal situation, right? They can walk away from their business and pursue other interests. Very different than what Northerners are thinking and doing at this time. Here during this period, is industrialization's beginning in the North, most Northerners are trying to either become farmers, getting cheap land out west, or they're getting involved in this new kind of market economy, either providing goods and services to other people in their area. But for most Northerners, it's really about what you can do for yourself. Having your own small business is kind of seen as the ideal. Sure, if you can make a big factory system or a whole corporate kind of idea, right? Factories in multiple locations, that's great. But the idea is you did it yourself. You did it on your own, right? Now, that doesn't mean you didn't take out loans. It doesn't mean you don't have workers. You do. But there's this idea that anybody can be successful in the North, that this idea that with enough hard work, enough dedication, success is possible for almost anybody. Now, true, some Southerners have that same ideology, right? That same idea. But for the most part, they kind of understand that if you're born into this planter class, you're probably going to stay there. That these people really do dominate things. And the reason they can dominate things is because they have time to protect their interests. Time that a lot of Northerners don't have because they're so busy kind of working on their farms or working in their businesses. So there is kind of this growing divide here. It starts small. It's very kind of imperceptible at first, but it is going to become bigger and bigger. This idea that Northerners are saying, look, I made something by myself, and Southerners saying, look, I've done so well, I don't have to work anymore, right? I can hire people to do work for me. I can hire people to make things run and keep me wealthy. So this is a big difference that's kind of starting to pop up here in the 1820s and in the 1830s. And in some ways, you kind of see how Southerners are starting to kind of critique themselves or critique the North by comparing them, the North and the South, together. This piece of propaganda, kind of a cartoon put out by some Southern planters in the 1830s, kind of points out to what's happening. Now they're going to use Britain, right, the industrial Europeans, as a kind of a contrast to their system. But when they say England, they really mean this industrializing northeastern part of the country. They mean places like Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, right, where all these factories are starting to spring up. But they're using Britain as kind of their example here because then it's less offensive to Northerners and because the impact is more easily to see of industrialization in places like Britain at this time. But the great thing about these kind of old political cartoons is the thing that even though there's a lot of writing here, we actually don't have to read this to understand what's going on here. Southerners are trying to say, hey, look, in these competing ways of being successful in this country, ours is the better system. And they're saying it by a peculiar way, if you will. At the top of this, propaganda cartoon, right? They show the Southerners have included a group of slaves. They call it slavery as it exists in America. Now look at what they're showing here, what they're depicting. Here in the background, you can make out these plantation owners kind of talking amongst themselves. And in the foreground here are a group of their slaves, slave children, one slave playing a musical instrument, and then others singing and dancing over to the side. And in a way, what these planters, this planter class, these masters, are trying to say is, look, our system works so well that not only is it creating wealth for us, the planters, the owners of all this, right, the owners of these slaves, but it's actually good for them too. The slaves are even benefiting from this system. It is such a good system. The slaves are well fed, they're happy, they're dancing, they're enjoying themselves, that they actually like their life being a slave in the South. Now, of course, we know that's not true, that they're fabricating a world that doesn't really exist. But for a lot of Southerners, especially these planters, this is very much how they feel at the time, right? That their system actually is a good system. And the way they can justify that, rationalize it, is by what's shown down here at the bottom. Now, again, they're talking about England here, but they really mean the North, right? This, especially the Northeast where these factories are popping up. And again, here in the background, it's something important to kind of see. They're showing us one of these textile factories, one of the first factories to open in the United States, are textile factories where they take the cotton grown by those slaves in the South, shipped to these cotton factories in the North, where it's turned into linen, into material that is then turned into different products. Well, that's kind of the background, right? So we know they're talking about this industrialized North. Here in the background are a couple wealthy investors or maybe bankers, right? Up front is one of these wealthy factory owners. And before him is a beggar, somebody on the streets of the North, right? That's too old to work, maybe. His clothes are getting threadbare, kind of starting to have holes in it, and he's looking for money. And the factory owner just keeps his hands in his pocket. He is not going to give this guy anything. This factory owner is going to say to this guy, look, if you're poor, that's your fault. You should have been taking care of you. You're on your own. And that's kind of the critique these Southerners are saying. They're saying, hey, look, we take care of everybody. Sure, we're rich and powerful, but we're taking care of everybody, even down to the enslaved people that we don't have to take care of. Right? We're taking care of them. That's how good our system is. Look at how the system in the North is. People in the North have to take care of themselves. If they're in trouble, there's nobody to turn to. The factory workers, that's who these two people are. Look at how they're dressed compared to the slaves in the upper picture, right? Their clothes are ragged, falling apart. They're emaciated. They're not well fed. They're certainly not happy and dancing around. They're hunched over. It looks like they're really struggling. So for a lot of Southerners here in the 1820s and 30s, especially this master class, these planters at the top of this Southern society that live in these big mansions, they're really trying to point out that they think their system is the superior system, that the way things run in the South is actually the way things should run everywhere. That white workers in the North shouldn't have to live the way they do in such harsh conditions. Now, it's true that sometimes things are rough in these northern factories, but also kind of keep in mind that's usually after you've been married for a while and have a lot of kids. If you're an individual, right, an unmarried man working in one of these factories, your life isn't actually this bad. You're actually doing okay most of the time, right? So again, the Southerners are kind of pointing out extremes here and looking at very extreme conditions and using that as to kind of be the norm for the North when it really isn't. But there is a grain of truth here, right? We know that there are some Northerners that are struggling. We know that they do have to sometimes send their kids and their wives to work to try and make enough money to keep their family fed and alive, really. So it is kind of rough here in the North. And Southerners are trying to say, look, our system is way better than what you're doing. Instead of having white factory workers, you should be using slave labor like us, and then everybody will be better. But again, we know that maybe that isn't entirely the truth, right? But it definitely is a perspective that a lot of these planters have here in the 19th century. And there's a reason that they've started to become defensive, if you will, right? Southerners are starting to worry. Now that cotton has provided a real cash cow for them, they're really afraid of losing that income, of losing that kind of economic growth that they're now starting to kind of count on, right? That they just kind of see unlimited growth here in the 1830s and 40s. So there is a reason they're kind of pushing back here against the North, saying, hey, look, our system actually works pretty well. Maybe you ought to fix your system before you start criticizing us. The first matter is something we talked about in our last lecture. This controversy over tariffs, right? These taxes on imports. Southerners hate them because if you're one of these people that own these big mansions, these tariffs make things really expensive for you. Buying furniture, buying imports from Britain, right? It's way more expensive because of these tariffs. And of course, because tariffs make imports so expensive, it means you're forced to buy expensive American goods. You can't actually buy cheap goods unless you go to Britain and buy them yourself, which not everybody, even rich Southern planters, have the time or money to go do all the time. So for a lot of Southerners, right, this tariff is a big problem. They want to get rid of it. They tried to get rid of it. They banded together under John Calhoun's leadership in 1828 to get rid of it, and it went up. Right? They called it the tariff of abominations. It was so awful. They tried again in 1832 to get rid of it. The best they could do is get it to go down. During the tariff controversy of 1832, when Andrew Jackson's president, he threatened South Carolina with military intervention if they don't start collecting the tax. Now, again, one of the ways they diffuse the situation is by lowering the tariff. But Southerners don't want to lower it. They want to get rid of it. And again, as we mentioned in the last lecture in Andrew Jackson's presidency, for Southerners, this tells them something. They want to get rid of this tariff, and they can't. It means political power is slowly but surely shifting to the North, and that frightens them. Because if Northerners can impose a tariff on Southerners, well, then they could also impose abolition if they wanted to. And that's really what John Calhoun and a lot of other Southerners are afraid of. So there is kind of this growing fear in the South of what the North may do. And there's this idea that they have to kind of explain to the North why they should leave the South alone, how the South is operating fine and Northerners just need to keep their nose out of things. And of course, that comes along at this time because of the growth of the abolition movement in the North. It's here in the 1820s and 30s that you see the first anti-slavery newspapers starting to be published on a wide scale. Abolition movements are starting to grow in the North in the 1830s. We'll talk more about that in our next lecture. But definitely, if you're a Southerner, you're starting to get worried that this system that's working pretty well for you is starting to come under attack, criticism from the North. And then you get kind of a palpable, real evidence of this, right? It's anecdotal, but it is evidence if you're a white Southerner here in the 1830s. And that's, of course, one of these periodic slave rebellions that takes place. Now, Southerners have crushed a number of them, but they're always worried about another one. And here in the 1830s, as the number of slaves really starts to grow in the United States, that fear of slave rebellions is palpable for a lot of Southerners. And then in the 1830s, it happens. A slave by the name of Nat Turner leads a slave rebellion in 1831, in kind of the winter of 1831, while all these other things are happening. And it's actually kind of successful at first. Nat Turner goes around. He's an enslaved person in Virginia, but he goes around at night kind of secretively to other plantations in his area, and sometimes walking miles at night, trying to avoid getting caught and getting in trouble. So he really risks himself organizing this thing. But he goes around to these various plantations and organizes a slave rebellion. And then in the slow months when there's no planting and there's no real agricultural work to do, Nat Turner leads a group of slaves on his plantation to attack the whites working on the plantation, even the master's family, the women that live there, even some of the children, and take control of the plantation. Then they move on to several other plantations. All told, about 30 whites are killed. Several dozens of whites flee in terror from this slave rebellion. Now, of course, it fails ultimately because there's no place for those slaves to go. There's no place that's really safe, right? It's just kind of a temporary respite from what they're having to endure in a lifetime of horrid conditions. But in the end, this slave rebellion is crushed. And it takes time, but eventually Nat Turner, the organizer of this rebellion, is captured as well. And what white Southerners do is they very much kind of make an example out of all this, as they have many times before in other slave rebellions. White Southerners find the perpetrators of the rebellion, the organizers, the ones that did the killing, the ones that did the fighting, and they make examples of them. For the Nat Turner's rebellion, most of them are killed either through hanging or being cut, right? I mean, just physically being eviscerated, swords being used on them. For Nat Turner, however, after he's tortured for a while to get information about how he assembled this rebellion, he is going to, after being tortured for several days, is actually going to be drawn and quartered. His body's going to be pulled apart by horses. And the enslaved population of these plantations are going to be forced to watch all these executions to kind of send a message that if you try this again, that'll be you next time. So very much Southerners feel kind of under attack in a very real way. But the story of Nat Turner goes even a little deeper than this. Once again, it kind of connects to the North. Because you see, the way Nat Turner was able to organize this rebellion was he was taught to read and write, which is actually against the law in Virginia where he was. But a preacher from the North, a minister, had gone down in the 1820s to kind of spread religion, to spread, it's called the Second Great Awakening. We'll talk more about that next week. But the Second Great Awakening is kind of a religious revival that takes place in the early 19th century. And one of the things that a lot of these ministers in the 1820s and 30s want to do is make sure everybody can read their Bible, and that included slaves. So this white minister from the north traveled into the south, asked permission to teach some of the slaves about the Bible. The minister, or the plantation owner, said, sure, why not, right? Not realizing that the minister meant he was going to teach them to read and write. Well, Nat Turner was seen by one of these ministers as somebody that would be a good preacher for slaves. So he was taught Bible stories, he was taught how to read and write the Bible, given a Bible, and Nat Turner went around holding religious meetings, right? Holding Bible studies with slaves. He was basically their minister, and he went around to each of these plantations doing that. Well, when he went around doing his ministerial work, Nat Turner would also read stories from the Bible about how slaves got freedom, about how slaves stood up to their masters. Not exactly the story that slaves were being given when they were taken to their master's church, right? Where white ministers in the church would tell slaves how happy they should be to be slaves, how they needed to obey their masters, right? So Nat Turner gave a much different view of the Bible than what whites were giving blacks in the South. And of course, he used that as inspiration for his rebellion. Now, when all of this comes out after the rebellion's crushed in 1832, a lot of Southerners looked at this and said, hey, look, Nat Turner never would have been a problem. This rebellion never would have happened if a white minister from the North hadn't got involved here, if he had just left us alone. So there is this idea here in the 1820s, 1830s, that Southerners kind of feel like Northerners are getting involved in their business when they don't need to be. Northerners have enough issues, enough problems of their own that they don't need to cause problems for Southerners. So they're becoming very defensive here in the 1830s and into the 1840s. And that is only going to grow as we move forward through all of this, right? And of course, as Southerners kind of come to hold even closer to slavery than they ever have before, right? Again, people like Jefferson and Washington, right? They're forebears of a lot of these Southern planters. They're thinking of getting rid of slavery in the 1780s and early 1790s. But here by the 1820s, 1830s, that's unthinkable. The number of slaves is bigger now. It's a harder problem to deal with. And of course, it just doesn't make economic sense to them. Now, while Northerners are using machines to make things and even machines to grow things now, right? Small farms in the North are very productive because they're starting to use mechanical devices to help gather in their crops during harvest season, right? They're making machines to help them run their farms. They're very simple and very expensive sometimes, but a lot of Northerners don't have to rely on manual labor anymore. Southerners can't imagine a world where that's true, right? To them, the easiest, the simplest, most efficient way to grow cotton is to use enslaved labor. That system is growing. Now, at the time, in the 1820s and 30s, that system is very normal for a lot of people. All right, a lot of people, even in the North, still have connection to slavery. Still, even maybe have slaves in places like Pennsylvania and New York, where it won't officially be gone completely until the 1840s and 1850s. So during this period, right, Southerners are kind of saying their system works, and it is tied into this market economy. They're a part of all of what's happening in the United States economically here in the 1820s and 1830s. It is part of this capitalistic market economy. Slave owners, like factory owners or businessmen in the North, they need banks for credit. They need to buy and sell goods, right? They're a part of all of this. They're integrated together. What's different, however, is what they do with a lot of their money. Part of it is to show off, to have these big houses, this nice clothes, right? But most of their money is actually going to be put back into that system. They're going to buy more land, they're going to buy more slaves so they can grow more cotton. In the North, it's more about diversifying. Maybe you have a cotton mill where you take cotton and turn it into linen. And then maybe if you're a factory owner, you buy a shoe factory and make shoes, right? You do something different. If you're a northern farmer, maybe you grow wheat one year and you grow corn the next, and then maybe even another crop the next year. You're doing different things at different times. The South isn't. It is just growing in this one direction. Grow as much cotton as you can, get as much land as you can, buy as much slave labor as you can to grow that cotton, to make that wealth. So again, some changes happening here, right? Some diversions starting to appear here. Some cracks between what makes the South and the North the same is starting to appear, right? And of course, one of the things we want to kind of note here is how these Southerners, these plantation owners, really see themselves. And it comes back to that word I mentioned earlier, paternalism or patriarchy. And now kind of keep in mind what that means. We're not talking about patriots here. We're not talking about, an egalitarian society. And for Southerners, it is a society where men dominate. The men are the leaders. The men are the ones that make the decisions. Men are the ones at the core of all of this. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't some women that have a tremendous amount of influence. After all, on a lot of these plantations, it's actually the wives that own a lot of the slaves. But their husbands often make the business decisions. Their husbands are often the ones in charge of what lands they're going to buy and work, what their slaves are going to be doing. That this is a system that is dominated by men, men of extreme wealth and a lot of power. That's what patriarchy is. And of course, those men want to protect that system that's put them at the top of it. So what we kind of see is this planter class, this master class as it's also known as, right? They very much want to protect their place in society. They feel that because they've gotten to the top, they deserved it, right? They earned it. But in the same time, they need to protect it. They know it's not quite as clear as that, right? The reason they're able to get to the top is because their parents were rich. They could send them to school, get an education, help run these things, learn new ways to grow cotton, right? Learn where are the best lands to invest in, right? They're connected to politicians so they can make sure that there are laws passed that are beneficial to them to build up more wealth, to gain more access to land. So this master class, this planter class that emerges in the South, they very much dominate things from top to bottom in a lot of ways, right? And of course, family honor is important to them, right? Making sure you take care of your family, because if you don't take care of your family, you're not being a good patriarch. You're not, running your plantation well, or your family well. Why should anybody trust you to lead the county or the state or even the country if you can't take care of yourself and your family? And of course, making sure that people understand your status, just how wealthy you are, how much influence you have. That's important to them, right? And the easiest way to show this, how rich you are, how successful you are, is through how many slaves you own and how big, how beautiful your plantation is. And again, this kind of contrasts with what's happening in the North, right? For Southerners, it's about showing off. It's about kind of demonstrating that wealth in a very real, visible way. Something that's been happening in the South really since almost the beginning of the Jamestown colony in 1607. In the North, however, some of those old Puritan ideas are still kind of there. This idea that you kind of you don't need to show off, that you should just kind of save your money, that you need to work hard for yourself. You need to kind of prove that you're somebody that deserves the success you've had. So again, difference is starting to emerge here in the way Southerners kind of define their society and the way Northerners define theirs. It's going to make possible these wider and wider splits as they kind of emerge over the next few decades. But definitely this idea of being part of this leadership of society, of Southern society, is an incredibly important aspect of what's happening here, this paternalism. And to kind of give a real world example of how all of this fits together, how all of this works, we're going to look at an actual family that does just this, right? They actually kind of are the Southern example of rags to riches, right? The belief that a lot of Southerners had of what is possible in this system they've built. And the family is the Davis family, and they're from Kentucky. Now remember, Kentucky is a good agricultural state. There's lots of good land there, but because it is a little farther north and the climate's a little colder, a little too wet in some ways, it is not a great place to grow cotton. So most of Kentucky is actually dominated by small white farmers, right? Small farmers that just grow a little bit of food. Again, to this day, some of the biggest industries are turning agricultural products into alcoholic products like whiskey, right? So bourbon, those kind of things. So that's actually what most Southerners have been doing. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some, slavery is very much a part of Kentucky's economy, but for the most part, it is a much smaller scale than what we'll see in other parts of the South. Kentucky is dominated by a lot of small white farmers, at least in numbers, if not in power, right? Well, the Davis family are some of these poor white farmers of Kentucky. They grow enough food to feed their family, maybe a little bit of extra to kind of afford a few luxury goods, but never enough. They never make enough money to actually buy more land and support their ever-growing family. And then one day, the head of the family, the father, dies. And it leaves his oldest son, Joseph, as kind of the patriarch now, as the leader of this family. And Joseph, at a very early age, he's in his mid to late teens when his father dies, makes a kind of a momentous decision. Here it's the 1830s, and he's decided it's time to move our family, right? It's actually the mid 1820s, right, when this is kind of playing out. And he makes a decision that we're going to move our family out of Kentucky and move down farther south to Mississippi, about as far west as you can get in the United States in the 1820s and 30s, right? He wants to move into this territory where the Native Americans are being pushed out. Now remember, from one of my earlier lectures, I showed you a map of where all these Native Americans lived. And then I showed you another map in another lecture of where they're growing all that cotton. Well, most of the cotton being grown is on that Native American land. Well, here in the 1820s, natives are being pushed off that land so it can then be sold to people like the Davis family where they can start growing cotton. At very low prices, this land is being sold at. Joseph Davis understands that. So what he does is by 1830, he's sold off virtually everything the family has in Kentucky. All their land, almost all their belongings, to raise as much money as he possibly can. He takes out as many loans as he can, and he moves his mother, his brothers and sisters down to Mississippi, where the cheapest of this Native American land is being sold off. There he starts by buying 50, 100 acres or so, buys a couple of slaves so he can use them for slave labor, and he starts growing cotton. When he harvests his first crop, he takes the extra money, the profits from it, and doesn't go out and buy a lot of fancy clothes, doesn't build a big giant house. He puts it into buying more land and more slaves. And he just keeps repeating the process all through the 1830s into the 1840s. By 1850, this guy has more than 9,000 acres of land and more than 300 enslaved people working that land for him. He has become successful. He's become rich, as a matter of fact. And I want to kind of put that in some perspective for you, right? I can say 9,000 acres, but what does that really mean, right? How much is that? Well, let's start with something we kind of know. Think about Fresno State, our entire campus, right? And that really means from Bulldog Stadium in the west, right, along Cedar Avenue, all the way over to Willow, from Shaw Avenue in the south, all the way north to Sierra. Almost all that territory is Fresno State land, okay? That is about 1,300 acres or so. So this guy essentially owns about 5 or 6 Fresno states. All right, that's how much land he works. If you want to stop and think about it, you could be traveling across his land. Look at your phone, bring up Google Maps. It'll tell you you're on Joseph Davis's plantation, and you could walk for an hour, and Google Maps will tell you you're still on Joseph Davis's plantation. You haven't essentially gone anywhere after walking for an hour or two across this guy's land, right? So this guy has become successful, and he's done it by owning human beings and growing the cash crop cotton and reinvesting in himself, reinvesting in his family, reinvesting in that land, right? In the system, if you will. So for some white Southerners, it is possible to kind of go from nothing to something here. But there's something more to this. Again, Joseph Davis is a patriarch now, right? He's the guy that's running this family. And he understands that he needs to protect the family's interests. But he can't do it. First of all, he's busy running all of this. Second of all, he never got a real education. because when his father died, he had to work the family farm. He didn't get to go to school. Now, he can read and write, but he doesn't have legal expertise, right? He's got to get people to do that. He can't really get into politics because he never learned how to speak well in public. He doesn't have a big orator's skills, right? So what he does is something else, right? He knows the family needs somebody to kind of represent them, to protect their interests, so to speak. So he turns that responsibility over to his younger brother. And in a very real way, Joseph Davis kind of becomes a father figure for his younger brother, Jefferson Davis. Joseph Davis is going to send his brother Jefferson to college, right, to make sure he gets a good education so he can build things up. Joseph is going to give his brother Jefferson several hundred acres to get started and about 20 or 30 slaves to work that land for him to help build up his own wealth. So again, this is kind of this idea of patriarchy. That's kind of how you perpetuate things. You help members of your family out. It shows how successful you are, how good you are at things, and kind of what's expected of your family now, right? And of course, Jefferson, after going to college, is then going to get into a military career, a way to kind of show that he's a leader. Besides being a slave owner, he can show that he can lead all kinds of different people, make important decisions. So he gets into the military. After he's done in the military, he gets into politics. Again, that's the way they're going to protect their interests, to make sure that the slave system that they're building continues on, that there's no limit to being able to buy slaves, that there's a way to keep pushing Native Americans out of the way, to get more land, to grow more cotton on it. So Jefferson Davis becomes a senator from Mississippi. Eventually, he fights in the war with Mexico and becomes a war hero, becomes what we would today call the Secretary of Defense. It was called the Secretary of War back then in the Fillmore administration. So this guy, Jefferson Davis, he is rising through the ranks. He's kind of shows what you're supposed to do as a Southerner. And of course, after his brother kind of gets him a start, right, he starts investing in his own land, his own slaves, right? Now, because he's gone for long periods of time, his wife and the people he has run his plantation just kind of maintain things. But still, he's able to amass about 1,800 acres on his own. He owns an entire Fresno state by himself and has more than 100 slaves that he uses as a labor force to make his wealth, to keep him able to do these things, right? So again, this is the idea of leisure time. That people like Jefferson Davis, because they are so wealthy, because they have people that can work and maintain that wealth for them, they can pursue other interests. They can do things like politics. They can kind of think about becoming president of the United States, which is very much on Jefferson Davis's mind. Well, he is going to be president eventually, but not of the United States. He'll be president of the Confederate States of America. So it does show you kind of how these Southerners think their system works, right? That even somebody like Jefferson Davis, who's born poor, can really have everything because their system works, right? At least for them. So Southerners have a palpable interest here, right? They see in a very real way that their system is a system worth defending, right? And it's not just the men that have a role here, right? They're not the only ones defending this. As I said before, a lot of the plantations, the slaves are actually owned by the wives, right? They're usually inherited from their parents when their parents die. And then when they get married, they take their slaves with them to really kind of form the core of the workforce on their husbands' plantations. So these Southern plantation wives have an important role to play here too. And again, they're kind of one of those images that pops up when we talk about this period of the Old South, right? The Southern Belle, these women that walk around in these big flowing gowns of very expensive imported material. Again, it's a way to kind of show off the family's wealth. If you can afford to buy your wife, these imported designs from France or Italy, it means your family's doing really well because, again, probably going to be taxed, probably very expensive, right? So being able to afford those things means your family's made it, you're doing really well. But that's not the only thing the plantation mistress is really kind of expected to do. She's also expected to kind of perform certain duties, right? To act a certain way. She has to act very proper, right? She also has to act kind of delicate. She's kind of a contrast to her husband, who has to act very masculine, very decisive, very much in control. Well, she has to be kind of the opposite of that, somebody that submits to her husband to show his leadership skills. If the husband has to be sometimes kind of mean and cruel, especially when he's disciplining either the whites that work on the plantation, his hired help, or his enslaved population, she's supposed to be kind of pure. She's kind of supposed to be the compassionate contrast to that. Now, that doesn't always happen because very often the plantation mistresses can be just as mean and cruel to the white workers or the enslaved people on their plantations as their husbands. But again, it's the image that they're supposed to project here. And also, another job or duty of the plantation mistress is she's kind of the social committee, right? She's the one that puts together parties. Think back to Jefferson Davis. When he marries Verena Davis, an important family in the Mississippi area, she's the one that's going to introduce him to people. She's the one that's going to hold parties that talk about Jefferson getting into politics, right? It's her friends and her family's connections that are going to pave the way for Jefferson to getting into politics and getting political offices. So in a lot of ways, these plantation mistresses have a lot of jobs. They wear a lot of hats. When their husbands are gone, they're ostensibly in control. They have to kind of maintain things, make sure the family keeps running, make sure that the hired help is doing their job, keeping the family's wealth up. They have a lot to do. But there's also something they can't do. And this is where we get into kind of some of the more sordid details of this and some of the kind of the more difficult things to talk about. Because one of the things that these plantation masters will do, or if they don't do it personally, they'll encourage others to do, is of course rape the female slaves. That is because that will give them more of an enslaved population, right? It's a cheap way to get more slaves. You don't have to go out and buy them. You can practically breed them as if people are livestock. It's a very disgusting thing to think about, but it's definitely happening on most of these plantations, right? Enslaved women are being raped either by other slaves at the forcing of some white overseer, or just as likely by the white overseers or even the plantation owner themselves, right? Again, to try and impregnate their slaves, to try and get more slaves, because they've written these laws into these slave codes that say, if you're black and have a child, if you're a black woman and have a child, that child is automatically a slave if you're a slave, right? They're free if you're free, but that's pretty rare in a lot of parts of the South, especially in places like Mississippi, where they have a very small free black population. So for the most part, if you're an enslaved woman, you have children, they're guaranteed to be slaves. Now, the plantation mistress can't do that. Because if she has an affair with a black man and a black slave on the plantation, that means because she's white and free, that the child will be free. But they can't have that, right? Because the child's father isn't the husband, right? The husband isn't being a good patriarch. His wife isn't being loyal and submissive, right? So she can't do that because it'll be obvious if she has sex with one of the black slaves or even an enslaved person, right? Even a free black person. It's proof that she's not being pure, that she's not upholding the family honor. So there's a real double standard here, I guess, is the way to kind of think about that. For men, their wives are a way to kind of show off their wealth and the luxuries they can afford. But for the women, these plantation mistresses, they have to be all the things that their husbands are supposed to be and almost never are, even if they themselves aren't truly that either, right? Again, a lot of these plantation mistresses will get upset that their husbands are having sex with other women, and they'll take it out on the women because they can't take it out on their husbands. So they can be just as cruel, just as bitter as anybody else, these plantation mistresses, right? So it is a weird world that's being kind of created here. There's this projected image, like we saw in that poster, right? That propaganda cartoon. There's this projected image of everybody's happy, everything's going well, and then there's the reality underneath all of that kind of contrasts to that. It really kind of shows us that it's not really this world that they're creating, right? That's not the reality that this propaganda that they're putting out portrays it as. Something else that's happening here kind of as all of this develops and as these roles are being created and kind of being enforced and perpetuated in Southern society is that people in this master class, in this plantation class. People like John Calhoun, that rich planter from South Carolina that's gotten into politics to try and defend slavery, right? Which is what you're supposed to do if you're one of these patriarchs, right? They've really kind of come to see their system as a good system. That we can see that there are a lot of problems here, that there are a lot of bad things happening. But they're convincing themselves here in the 1820s and 1830s that it's just the opposite, that it's actually a good thing that they've done. John Calhoun actually writes a pamphlet here in the 1830s called Slavery is a Positive Good, saying that their system actually is a good system, not just for somebody like John Calhoun, but really, by extension, for everybody, the entire nation, as a matter of fact. So let's read this excerpt and just kind of think about what this guy Calhoun and other planter class people like him are really kind of saying about this system they're creating here in the South. But let me not be understood as admitting, even by implication, that the existing relations between the two races in the slaveholding states is an evil. So again, kind of wordy and a little bit of a kind of double negatives and that kind of stuff. But what he's trying to say here is, look, don't misunderstand me, he's saying, right? Things have never been bad in the South. But actually today, it's not just that it's not bad, it's actually far different than that. Things are actually going great. He says, I hold it to be a good, this slave system that we've created, as it has thus far proved itself to be to both. Now listen to what he means by that. When he says both, he means to white Southerners and to black Southerners, the majority of which are enslaved people. And he goes on to say, and will continue to prove so if not disturbed by the fell spirit of abolition. So what John Calhoun's saying here is, the system we've created, us Southerners have created here in the South, is actually a good system, right? There's nothing wrong with it. And it's actually not just good for me, the slave owner, the plantation owner, it's actually good for my slave as well. Go back to that piece of propaganda I showed you, right? That's kind of what they're saying. Our system is good, even for the slaves. They enjoy being slaves. They like the system that we've created. He says the only thing that can screw this up is you Northerners with your abolition ideas coming down here and causing problems. Go back to the idea of the Nat Turner Rebellion, right? The Nat Turner Rebellion was created by Northerners getting involved in something they don't understand and causing problems. And Calhoun goes on here to kind of say this. I appeal to facts. Never before has the black race of Central Africa, from the dawn of history to the present day, attained a condition so civilized and so improved, not only physically, but morally and intellectually. So Calhoun is even going farther here. He's saying, look, back home in Africa, African Americans wouldn't have had it as good, right? By bringing them here to the United States, we've exposed them to our civilization, our politics, our culture, and we've done well for them. Physically, they're bigger and stronger and healthier than they would be back home in Africa, and they're better morally and intellectually because they've been exposed to our culture. Now, of course, he's basically saying that blacks back in Africa are not civilized, have no culture, have no intellectual property, and he's completely wrong on that, obviously, right? There are fantastic African civilizations that have been created. There are huge empires being created by Africans in Africa. So he's completely discounting all of that and saying exactly the opposite, that it's blacks here in America, taken from Africa, that are actually at the forefront of their race, when in actuality, that's not the case at all, is it? So it's really kind of amazing what white Southerners are trying to convince themselves of here, right? They're trying to say, look, we've done a favor for people, that our system is actually so good it takes care of everybody, right? And it's actually helping the nation because we're providing cotton at such a low cost that we're able to turn it into goods that are now starting to be shipped all across the world and building up wealth, not just for us, the slave owners, but for the entire nation. So here in the 1820s, 1830s, Southerners have really gotten over any of these qualms that they might have had back in Washington and Jefferson's day of what it meant to be a slave owner, and they are doubling down on it now. They're ready to defend it. They think it is a system worth defending. And you can kind of see it's not just here in the 1830s. This continues on. In the 1850s, a guy by the name of George Fitzhugh, also a South Carolinian, he's going to write a pamphlet called Blessings of Slavery, which is basically just a reiteration of John Calhoun's work from the 1830s. And there he's going to say, look, we don't overwork slaves, right? If we did, they'd quit working for us. He says, look, we give slaves lots of time off. We allow them, have Sundays off. When the weather's bad, we just let them relax and enjoy themselves, right? And then he says, look, we give them the leadership that they need because they can't possibly take care of themselves. So for a lot of Southerners like George Fitzhugh, there's this idea that Calhoun's put forward that whites are kind of the leadership for blacks, that these plantations provide structure of life that a lot of people wouldn't have otherwise, that this master class, these patriarchs, are doing a good job, is going to be perpetuated 20, 30 years into the future by other Southerners like George Fitzhugh. The one thing Fitzhugh's trying to kind of say is our system works. Contrast that with what's happening in the factories, where people are overworked, where they don't have a lot of free time, where they're forced to kind of do things that they don't want to do. He says none of that happens on our southern plantations. Now, we know a lot of that's not true. Yes, there are overworked and underfed and underpaid workers in factories, but they can do something about it. They can quit. Right? They can go someplace else. They can try something else. That's not true for enslaved people, African Americans enslaved on plantations. They're in a very different world. And the truth of that actually kind of comes up in that George Fitzhugh never talks about where all this exposure to culture, where all this exposure to intellectual property and ideas that supposedly is happening for African American enslaved peoples, right? What it's supposed to mean for the future. There's no talk about giving African Americans their own state. There's no talk about freeing them. There actually isn't any movement beyond slavery for most African Americans in the South. So we see that there are some issues here, right? These white Southerners are creating kind of a fantasy world that justifies what they're doing and protects their interests. And that is very much about what is kind of happening here during this period, right? That Southerners have to kind of justify what they're doing. Deep down, subconsciously, everybody knows what's going on is awful. But if they can convince themselves that it's really not as bad as they think, then they can continue to let it go and continue to build up this wealth and continue to kind of profit from it, really, right? And what they do to kind of help justify this, to help kind of underpin this system that's being created, people in the South tied to slavery, and not just in the South, even people in the North are doing this, right? There is this idea of racial superiority that's crept in. It started in Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries. Now it's become ingrained in society, right? Because of those slave codes written all through the 17th and into the 18th centuries, because of kind of the way they view the world and the way they write a lot of their political philosophies, a lot of white Americans have kind of depicted African Americans as backward, inferior, needing of leadership. Think about Thomas Jefferson and his writings on race in Virginia. He couldn't see African Americans taking care of themselves any more than a lot of people 2 or 3 generations later in the South would, or even in the North. And they also played on some kind of older ideas besides kind of these invented theories of the day. And that is the simple fact that in a very real way in human nature, we kind of identify different meanings to different colors. Red is danger, right? Green is usually good and healthy. Blue is kind of loyalty, if you will. White is seen as kind of being good or pure, and black is often seen as bad or dangerous, right? Well, they start taking kind of those Southerners here in the 1830s and 40s start taking these ideas that are kind of at the core of human nature and start applying them racially, which of course is absurd, right? But they do that, again, to kind of help justify what they're doing, to help protect this system that is actually so beneficial to them, right? And a way I would say it is these paternalists, right, are kind of father figures in a way, but they're incredibly racist about it, right? They are trying to kind of be these leaders, but only for the leadership benefits that it provides for them, not for everybody else, right? Again, they kind of say that this system is a good system, that these people that we control, that we own, really aren't people because they can't take care of themselves, right? At best, they would be like children or dependents. But in reality, they kind of see them as more of livestock to be owned, property to be owned and managed like everything else on their plantations. So these racial underpinnings of all of this are very powerful, and it allows them to justify what they're doing, and allows them to justify a lot of the heinous activities that actually make all of this possible, as we'll kind of see. But again, they kind of play on these old tropes, these old ideas of how the world works and how the world looks to help kind of justify what they're doing, to help underpin what they're saying, to kind of provide some kind of pseudoscience to it, right? And what I kind of use to kind of explain this, right, these ideas that these white Southerners are playing on, is something that we kind of know about from our popular culture today. This is a hamburger that's sold by Burger King most Halloweens. Now, here in the United States, this has kind of dropped off, but it's still a big deal in Japan. And it's a novelty item, right? Because nobody buys this. They don't buy it to eat it, right? They just buy it to look at it, right? Especially in Japan. It's just kind of a novelty. It's just kind of a fun thing. But what's amazing about this is just the regular burger, right? This is the regular Burger King burger you buy all year long. But here around Halloween, they add a dye to the buns to make it black. And what happens is nobody wants to eat it because there's this idea that somehow there's something wrong with it if it's black, right? That's what Southerners are doing. They're playing on this idea. They're saying, "Hey, look, we're going to take this trope that we kind of have in our kind of primordial mindset, and we're going to apply it to human beings. We're going to say because they're black, they're different. Because they're different, they're inferior. And because they're inferior, we can do whatever we want." So here in the 1830s and 40s, white Southerners are using a lot of what we would today call pseudosciences to back up, to bolster, to support this system that they're creating. And it's not just kind of these pseudosciences. There's another authority they often turn to over and over again, as I kind of mentioned earlier. And that, of course, isn't really kind of legal standings, although they'll use those as well. But they'll use a very strong, cultural, powerful force in the United States, and that, of course, is religion. They'll use the Bible to justify this. Again, in white churches all across the United States, even in the North, they'll tell stories that kind of say slaves need to be kept in control, that they need to submit to authority, right? They need to listen to their masters. Well, a lot of abolitionists and a lot of black Americans are reading other stories in the Bible that are saying, no, God wants slaves to get their freedom. God wants masters to be cast down, right? And to be put out of power. So there's a lot of conflict in the ideas here. But for a lot of slave owners, they can justify what they're doing either through these pseudosciences or by using kind of these cultural totems like the Bible to kind of say what I'm doing is right, and because it's right, you need to listen to me, and I can do what I want to do. And I think maybe this piece of Southern propaganda, this picture that runs in newspapers, primarily in the North, is to kind of justify what Southerners are doing here, right? Kind of sums up the view white Southerners, this planter class, has of itself here before the Civil War. Again, we see in this picture, here's the planter, right? A youngish man dressed in his nice fine clothes, taking a tour of his plantation. And he brings his family with him. His wife is coming along dressed in her finery, again, kind of showing off the wealth and status of the family. And they've brought their children with them as well. The idea here is the plantation owner, the master, is going to show his children what it is they're supposed to do, all right? Who these people are that they own that do a lot of the work for them. And again, there's this idea that they're all one family. He's the patriarch. Everybody's under his control. He's responsible for them. And then in the captions, you kind of get this feeling, right? This old elderly slave over here, right? He's too old to work now. He sees his master and the master's family come down to the slave quarters to kind of visit with them and take a tour. And he sees the master and he goes, God bless you, master. You feed and clothe us. And when we're too old to work, like me, you provide for us still anyway. So what supposedly is going on here is this older slave is saying, okay, I'm too old to work now, but I still have food, I still have clothes, you're still taking care of me. That's, again, this idea of patriarchy, this idea that the system's working for everybody. And supposedly the master would reply in this situation as he tells his children what's going on here. These poor creatures, these enslaved people that we own, are a sacred legacy for my ancestors. I've inherited all of this, right? And while I still have money, he says, nothing shall be spared to increase their comfort and happiness. That's supposedly why Southerners are saying we take care of everybody. Yes, we have a good life. Yes, we are rich. Yes, we're successful. But so is everybody else. The people that work for us, the whites that work for us, get good paying jobs. The blacks that we enslaved are happy and content and taken care of, right? They don't have to worry about things like they would if they had been left home in Africa. And everything is great here. Now, of course, we know that this is a lie. But this is what Southerners are trying to sell not only Northerners on, but themselves as well. This is how they're viewing their world. And in a big way, this still permeates to this day. You can still hear accounts of people where they say, well, slavery wasn't that bad, because they look at propaganda like this and say, well, everybody appears to be pretty happy. But what you have to understand is you're looking at the view of the person on top. And of course, to them, everything's fine, right? They like this system. It works for them. We don't have their side of the story, the enslaved people's side of the story yet. We're only looking at it from one way. And again, kind of to keep going in this theme, here's a family portrait, right? It's a photograph. In the 1830s and 40s, photography is kind of becoming a thing. And one of the ways you can show that you're rich and successful is by going out and getting a portrait done. Now, you used to would have had an artist come by and paint a picture for you, but that took a lot of time and was very expensive, so only the richest of people could afford that. But here in the 1830s and 40s with photography, now you can pay a photographer to do something in a couple of minutes that it took an artist maybe months to do. And you could do it quickly. So what's happening here is we see a picture of a middle-class Southern family, okay? The husband over here on the right, he's probably a professional, a doctor, a lawyer, maybe a professor at one of the colleges that rich Southerners send their kids to, right? I think this family's from Baltimore, Maryland, kind of a bigger city in the South, one of the biggest cities in the South, as a matter of fact. And they're going to kind of show how well their family's doing. Again, kind of a way to show off, tell people that they're doing pretty good here in this world, right? So the husband's brought his wife. They've dressed in some of their nicest clothes. Again, they're kind of showing off a little bit. They've brought their newborn child with them, and they've brought somebody else. When the wife gets pregnant in these middle-class families, because they haven't had a need, they don't own land, they're not working cotton fields, right? They work in cities or they work in small towns, right? They really didn't have a need for slave labor. But even middle-class families are starting to sometimes own slaves here in the 1830s and 40s, but not as field labor, not as agricultural labor, but as domestic help. So what's happened is this family's gotten married and they've had a child. They've gone out and purchased or gotten from a family member who has slaves a young enslaved woman to be kind of domestic help. Really, we call her a nanny today. Her job would be to kind of help raise the child, take care of the child so the mom's not so overwhelmed, help clean the house, help cook the food, right? That's kind of her daily chores, if you will. And what is being kind of portrayed here by this family is that we're all a family, including this young enslaved woman. She's a part of the family, right? We're one big happy family. Now, I realize nobody's smiling here in this picture, and that's just the way photography works back in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. It takes 2 or 3 minutes for an exposure. So you cannot smile that long. Your muscles will just ache, and you'll quit smiling, and that'll ruin the picture. So what they end up doing is just kind of look very serious, because that's easy to kind of stay still and look serious and not move during these exposures, right? So don't take too much into this at the fact that they're all kind of frowning. But there is one way we can kind of see what's going on here. And that's through their body language. Because this family portrayal, this patriarchy that they're trying to kind of put out there in this picture, we can tell is maybe not as true as they want it to seem, right? Because look at what's happening in this picture. Here's the mom, right? She's just had a baby. And yet she is not leaning towards her child. She's actually leaning towards her husband. Now, that doesn't seem too weird, except, again, she's not even holding her child, right? She's leaning away from the other person in this picture, the enslaved woman on the left. And while it does look like the enslaved woman's leaning in, if you actually notice, that's just because she's tilted her head. If you look at her shoulders, she's actually leaning away. So in the body language, what we kind of see is there's actually quite a separation here. The enslaved woman does not feel like she's part of this family, actually probably doesn't even want to be in this picture, right? The family is just trying to show off. She's, again, just kind of like part of the furnishings, right? She's just part of the background here. She's just a way for this family to show off. She's not really a part of this family. And the way to really kind of drill down into this, right, as we kind of move into this projected image that Southerners have of their world, right, the way they want it to be, the way they're kind of self-deluding themselves to be, and the way it actually is to look at the story of this guy, James Henry Hammond. He is a Southern plantation owner. He's somebody that has a plantation outside of Charleston, South Carolina. And he's actually done so well for himself that he not only has a big plantation of about 2,000 acres outside of Charleston, but he actually has a really nice house in Charleston as well. And that's kind of important if you're one of these planters, because it's where you need to go to make sure that laws are passed that benefit you. It's where you're going to sell your cotton off, right? So it's where you have a lot of your business operations. So this guy, James Henry Hammond, and his family, have become quite important in the South Carolina area, especially in Charleston. And they're one of these big, powerful families kind of running things in their area. Well, James Henry Hammond, like a lot of these master class, right, these rich plantation owners, has gotten in to politics, of course, right, as a way to kind of protect that his interests, to a way to kind of make sure that he stays at the top, right? And what's kind of come to him here, right, what he's found out running in some Southern newspapers is talk that there's an abolitionist in the North by the name of Thomas Clarkson who's interviewed a bunch of runaway slaves here in the 1830s and 40s. And this guy Clarkson has run a pamphlet or a book, right? He's printed a book that really kind of lays open all the sordid details of what the South is really like, especially for the enslaved people. In Clarkson's books, in these interviews with all these escaped slaves, all these slaves tell stories about brutal physical beatings, about women being raped, forced to have children, often by the white men that live and work on these plantations, how families are sold off to intimidate members of the enslaved population, right? To make them do what people want. Or sometimes they're just sold off because the family needs the money, right? The owning family needs money, so they just sell off their slaves to different people and break up families to do it. So this guy Clarkson tries to point out that what Southerners are trying to portray themselves as is far from the truth, that it's actually much more brutal, much more sordid, just really kind of disgusting in a lot of ways. And a lot of Northerners are shocked by what they're reading. And so are Southerners. People like Hammond are incensed. Hammond feels he needs to defend the South. Again, this idea of honor, right? Hammond says this guy Clarkson doesn't know what he's talking about, what he's writing in his books. He's never actually been to the South. All he's doing is talking to some disaffected runaway slaves who probably are just lying so that they can get sympathy. So Hammond takes it upon himself as a politician and a planter in South Carolina to respond to these accusations that Clarkson has dug up. So he writes a series of letters that he publishes in newspapers, both in the North and the South, kind of refuting everything that Clarkson said. First, he kind of goes into this idea that slaves are beaten regularly. Hammond says Clarkson's got it all wrong. There's no way we would mistreat our slaves because then they would never work for us. After all, we own these people. If we mistreat them, they won't do the job right anymore, or they won't be able to work if we beat them too awfully. So all these stories that they're talking about being mistreated aren't true. That if they were mistreated, it's because they did something pretty awful and they deserved whatever punishment they met. So Hammond starts tearing into all these stories that Clarkson's put out there. And then he goes on to say, not only are we not physically abusing our slaves, but we don't have any improper sexual relations between the races, right? Hammond points out that every southern state has laws saying it's illegal for whites to have sex with blacks, right? That they just have all kinds of laws that say this shouldn't happen. We saw that in our slave codes, right? Back when we were looking at the colonial South, right, of Virginia. Those laws pop up everywhere. And Hammond says, look, if it was true, if we were going around, if white men were constantly raping enslaved women, there'd be all kinds of proof for this. There'd be all these mixed race children running around. Well, they're not here. We look around our plantations and all we see are white people and black people and nothing in between. Well, Southerners love these letters, right? Here's a guy standing up for them. Here's a guy kind of defending their system, kind of defending their honor. And in return, they're going to elect this guy, James Henry Hammond, governor of South Carolina, right? Is kind of a reward for him doing a good job and standing up to Clarkson. And because his letters go out all over, are printed in northern newspapers, it kind of cloudies the air, right? Muddies the water, I guess is really what I'm trying to say. It makes it hard for Northerners to really understand what's going on, right? Here's a guy interviewing slaves and Thomas Clarkson saying that slaves are mistreated. Here's another guy, James Henry Hammond, saying that's not true. It's stupid to mistreat our slaves because we'll get nothing out of it. It'll just ruin the system, right? Who do you believe here? So a lot of Northerners are saying, I don't know who to believe, so I'm not going to pay attention. But we know kind of what really is happening here, because James Henry Hammond left a series of diaries. So did his wife. And what we find out is when James Henry Hammond dies of cancer just a few years after all of this, he gives kind of instructions to his oldest sons on what to do with the plantation, their slaves, their wealth, how to kind of keep it all going, right? And then he comes down to what to do with their slaves. And Hammond tells his sons, slavery in the family will be their happiest earthly condition. So what he says to his sons, right, is he tells them, look, these slaves are part of our family, and you can't get rid of them. You need to keep them with us, okay? Don't sell them off. Even if you need money really badly, find another way to do it. Keep them with us. And at first, right, if you look at this, you go, well, gosh, that kind of seems like this patriarchy, right? That this guy actually is a good guy. He cares about his slaves. He's actually trying to take care of them, trying to tell his kids to take care of them, right? That's the system Southerners say. But it's deeper and actually awfuler than that. What is truly just dark and sinister about all this is when he says, slavery in the family is their happiest earthly condition. What he means is these are literally our family. James Henry Hammond went about and raped a number of enslaved women that he owned, right, to get them to have more slaves. He did it over and over again, especially to young girls, 16, 17, 18 years of age. After he got them pregnant, he'd have no more to do with them and move on to another woman. But he would encourage his sons to go and then have sex, rape the same women that he was now done with, to force them to have another child, right? So when it came down to the time of his death, James Henry Hammond, it's estimated, owned many of his own children and grandchildren. That a significant portion of his slaves, somewhere between a quarter and half of his slaves, were actually his own children or grandchildren. That's what he's talking about here in this instructions to his sons. Now, how do we know that? Because of his wife's diaries, right? She knew her husband was going out having sex with the enslaved women. She could not stand it, but she couldn't ask for a divorce because it was illegal. The best she could do was leave the plantation, right? If she asked for a divorce, her husband would give her a divorce, but she'd get nothing. She'd have nothing. She would lose everything in the divorce. So in the end, James Henry Hammond's wife, the best she could do was just go to their house in Charleston, South Carolina, and just get away from the plantation and not watch what was happening around her, right? But she recorded this information so we know what was going on here. So in reality, everything Clarkson writes in his book about how awful slavery is actually is true. Hammond talks about how he disciplines slaves, how cruel he can be. His wife mentions in her diary how cruel she is sometimes because she's so upset about what he's doing, right? She takes it out on their enslaved people. That in the end, this system is absolutely awful. And that brings us to the reality of everything, right? In the end, this paternalism, if it even exists, it is a pretty rare and limited thing. Most Southerners, when they were forced to, right, they admitted what it was really all about. That the only way this system really worked, the only way that this wealth was actually going to be created and these plantations could work, was if Southerners used violence. It was essential. The system didn't work without it. Slaves weren't happy being slaves. They sang in the fields because they were sad, not because they were happy. They danced because they were forced to dance, not because they wanted to. Or if they were dancing, it was just to escape just a truly oppressive, brutal situation that they were in and to kind of find a few moments of respite. All right? It was for them, not for other people. But they weren't celebrating the condition that they were in. They weren't celebrating the fact that they were enslaved. So here in the 1830s and 40s, the reality of this situation is much different, as we already know, than what Southerners are portraying. But it does kind of show this dichotomy that's in the South, right? How white Southerners can see things in a positive light because it benefited them and just totally ignore what was happening to black Southerners, right? And that's what we're going to look at next. Now, some of these images are going to be disturbing. Some of the things I'm going to talk about are going to be disturbing, so please just fast forward if you have to, but try to keep an open mind here and just try to think about what we're talking about, right? This image is the reality of what's happening in the South. On Hammond, Calhoun's, Jefferson's plantations, this is what's happening. This enslaved man, right, former slave, he runs away in the 1840s from a plantation, I believe it's in Tennessee, and makes his way to the north. And when he gets there, these abolitionists that help him, all right, are so shocked by what he's been through that they feel they have to take a picture, that people just have to understand what's going on here. So in this picture, what we see is this man hasn't been beaten once in his life. He has been beaten over and over again. Sort of like what we talked about in that film clip on the slave ship, right? These beatings are brutal, right? They're literally tearing your back off with a leather whip that often has pieces of metal or glass on the end of the whip to try and make it just even more vicious and cruel, right? This man has been beaten so many times that his scars have scars, right? He's just covered across his back. So the reality of the situation is absolutely different than what Southerners are trying to portray it as. Another thing that's very different is what it meant to be free and black in the South, right? Free blacks truly weren't free, right? Now, true, they weren't owned by somebody, but they weren't able to do whatever they wanted either. They couldn't go to school. They couldn't get educations. They couldn't have whatever job they wanted. They were very limited in their freedoms. And for the most part, in southern states, especially in places like Charleston, South Carolina, you had to have a medallion that proved you were free, or people would think you were an escaped slave and sell you off to a slave owner, right? So even if you're free, things are pretty precarious for you in the South, right? what we really find out is there's none of this uplifting cultural, intellectual learning going on, right? This paternalism doesn't really exist. The only way that paternalism exists is to make these planters more money, to allow them to amass more wealth and power. That those racial attitudes we talked about absolutely permeated all of this. It allowed white Southerners to say, well, that group of people over there that we've enslaved, they're not us, they're not human like us, we can do whatever we want to them. And that's what allowed them to do the horrible, awful things like in that picture that they're doing over and over again. Because if they're not human beings, it makes it possible to do that. You can wrap your head around it. But if you do see the enslaved people as people, then it means everything you're doing is wrong and has to stop. So white Southerners are really kind of living a lie, if you will. And you kind of see it in their laws, actually, right? Here's a slave code from Alabama in 1832. As they're pushing Native Americans out of the way and selling their lands off, people are rushing in, buying land, growing cotton, bringing slave labor in. But look at what this law says. It's a penalty of $250 to $500. Now multiplied by about 100, and that's what the cost is to us today. So this is like a $50,000 fine, right? Was set for teaching any enslaved or even free black to read, write, or spell. So if they become literate in any way because of you, you can be fined. What are they afraid of? Slave rebellions, right? Learning how to get free, learning how to escape, or how to encourage other slaves to rebel. So they're not going to allow you to do that. Some of these laws also forbid more than five or more black people to congregate in any place off the plantation. So if you're black and you're walking along with another group of black people, right, you're going to be expected to be escaped slaves. You're going to have to prove you're free, or if you are enslaved, you're going to have to prove that you're congregating with more than 2 or 3 other black people with orders from your owner, or you're going to be severely punished. So this is pretty scary if you stop and think about it, right? There's really no civilizing going on here, right? There's no opportunity here for African Americans to get ahead and become a part of this system. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't some free blacks that do kind of succeed in the situation. There are stories of individual blacks who become slave owners themselves and plantation owners themselves, but they're incredibly rare, right? You can't use one exception to say that everything's equal, right? The fact is, for every one black slave owner, there's hundreds of white slave owners. So this is very much a one-way street here to kind of build up white power, white wealth in the South off the backs of the enslaved people that they own, right? And it's what makes those escape narratives like the one Clarkson puts out, like the ones done by Benjamin Drew, so important, that they actually explain the reality of the situation, that they tell Northerners, hey, look, what Southerners are selling, what they're trying to tell you isn't actually true, right? And this brings us to another facet of all of this, right? I've spent a lot of time here talking about the people on top, the wealthiest of Southerners, right? This planter class, this master class that really runs things. But how much of the South actually owns slaves, right? What are we talking about here? Is it just this master class, these people that own hundreds of slaves, about 3% of the Southern population that owns slaves? Is it about 25%, about 1 out of 4 Southerners that own slaves? Or is it virtually about half the population? Do half of white Southerners own slaves? What do you think? Which one do you think is the right answer? All right, I'll tell you, it's C. Only about 1 out of 4 Southerners actually own slaves. And out of those, most Southern slave owners only own 1 to 10 slaves. So slavery is actually a pretty small system in the South. And yet, Southerners are going to fight for it when time comes in 1860. Even though 3/4 of white Southerners don't own a slave, and even of those white Southerners that do own slaves, most of them don't have to have that slave labor. They're still all going to fight to protect that system when the time comes. So we have to ask ourselves what's going on here. Because here's kind of a typical white Southerner family, right? This would be a small, poor white farming family, right? They own maybe 50 to a couple hundred acres. Maybe they grow a little bit of cotton, but for the most part, they grow foodstuffs to feed themselves and to maybe sell off extra food to these slave owners in the area, or to sell off to factories in the north if they're close enough. So what do we see going on in this picture? Well, first of all, we notice that the young kid is shaking his head, and because of the exposures, he's blurred, right? But everybody else is holding themselves pretty still. But what they're doing here in this picture is, because this is before flash photography, they're bringing outside of the house the things that are most valuable, right? They're, again, trying to show off their wealth. They're dressing as nicely as they can, just like that middle class family I showed you earlier. And of course, they're showing the things that they're kind of proud to own. Things like this table that's probably been manufactured, the chairs that they bought from a store or a catalog, the metal cooking pot that they use to cook their meals in. This is what they own that is valuable to them, right? So think about it. Is that a lot? Are these guys doing really well here? So what's in it for them? Why would this guy pick up a gun in 1860 to fight so some rich planter can own hundreds of slaves and stay really, really wealthy? It's what we got to kind of figure out here, right? Because when you get down to it, in the South, it's primarily white, right? Especially in the by 1860, about 70% of the population, between 4 and 6 million people, are white. Somewhere between 3 and 4 million are black. And of those 3 and 4 million black population, most of that is an enslaved population. And when you drill down even further here, in 1860, only about 3% of the people that actually own slaves own more than 50. 75% of all Southerners, I said before, don't even own slaves. And when you get down to that, the planter class really has everything. They own the best land. They have most of the money. They dominate local politics, so they pass laws that are good for them. An example of this is there is no public education in the South before 1860. Or it's very limited to maybe like a state university, that kind of thing. There is no public education for this guy's young kid when that kid grows up, right? It's happening in the North. They're building public schools in the North. They're not great. They're not everywhere, but they are available, at least in some places. Not happening in the South. Why? Because the planters don't want to pay taxes that are going to help increase competition. They don't want small farmers to get more wealthy, to get more land, to become more successful, because that'll limit their profits, that'll limit their ability to dominate, and limit their power when you get down to it. So what we kind of have to ask ourselves is, what is actually in it for a lot of white Southerners? Why are they going to support this system? Why are they going to buy into this? Why are they going to fight to preserve it when so many of them aren't directly benefiting from this system, right? So what is here? What is going on? Well, first and foremost, what we have to kind of keep in mind is, if you're a white Southerner who owns land or has some kind of property, right? You've been able to participate in politics from almost the beginning, right? Even when we were part of the British Empire, you had an ability to participate in politics. So you felt at least included in some ways. Sure, you had to vote between this rich guy and that rich guy who really only took care of themselves, but at least you had a voice in this. Second of all, those racial ideas that are kind of being perpetuated here in 19th century America, well, they put you on top, right? And when you get down to it, I think that's maybe the most powerful thing here. As poor as you might be as a white Southerner, as bad as things might be for you, you can always look out there and say, but I'm not them. Because legally, it's not possible. The only people that can be enslaved are African Americans, right? White Americans just can't be in that same distinction, right? Because it's based on race. So if you're a white Southerner, especially a poor white Southerner, this system doesn't offer you much of anything. But it does offer you one thing, a floor, right? Things can't get any worse for you. You can never be an enslaved person, right? Things will never be that bad. But to go even further in this, what I want to kind of remind you is that the reason a lot of Southerners, and even some white Northerners, are so slow to come to abolition is this one important fact, that by 1860 there are 4 million enslaved African Americans in this country. And one of the things that'll make some white Southerners fight for slavery and keep some white Northerners from fighting against slavery is this simple fact. What happens if you end slavery? Now, back in 1790, when there's only 600, 700,000 enslaved people in the United States, you could kind of come up with an idea of how to incorporate them, right? How to deal with bringing that group of people in as citizens now. But by 1860, when you're talking about 4 million people, well, if you're a factory worker in the North, if you're a white farmer in the North, if you're a white farmer in the South, right? The last thing you want, more competition. Because what's going to happen when you free all of those slaves? They're going to need land, they're going to need jobs, they're going to be competition for you. And that's really, when you get down to it, what's explaining a lot of this, right? I'll look at this a little bit more in depth from the Northern perspective in the next lecture. But I want you to kind of keep that in mind. If you're a white Southerner, even if you're not making a lot of money here, even if you really don't have a vested interest in slavery, the alternative to this, freeing African Americans, you see that as bad for you. Now, you really shouldn't, because in the end, there's still plenty of land, there's still plenty of opportunities here. It's not going to be the dire end of all things when slavery ends in 1865, right? But if you're a white Southerner, you're afraid of that alternative, right? You're afraid of what happens when slavery ends. You see it as bad for you. So even though you're not getting anything out of slavery, the opposite, right? You're more afraid of the opposite of what happens to you when slavery ends. Things might actually get worse, because now you could be at the very bottom. Things could be no worse than how you have it, right? So that's a powerful incentive if you stop and think about it, and it's going to definitely come into things. But do kind of keep these things in mind as we kind of conclude here. That slavery absolutely is permeating the South here in the early 19th century. It is defining it by the 1840s and 1850s. And that racism, this idea that these two groups of people, whites and blacks, are different and can be treated differently, is absolutely crucial to this system that they've built in the South. And of course, as the North kind of goes its own way and starts kind of developing off in other tangents that we'll talk about next time, it means that the North and South start seeing each other as very different. And Southerners, becoming more and more protective of slavery because they see it as beneficial to them, are resenting Northern attitudes more and more, right? Especially the ideas of abolition, that Northerners can tell Southerners what they can and can't do, is becoming very grating to a lot of people in the South. So kind of keep those things in mind as we kind of move forward here into our next lecture on the North and what's happening in the North in the 19th century. Until then, thank you very much for your time, and I'll see you next time.